ईश्वर योग जय श्री गुरु महाराज जी की जय। ओम ह्रीं ऋतं त्वं चलो गुणजी गुणेभ्यः नक्तं दिवं सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे यतोऽहं तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगच्च भजनं भवभेदकारी गच्छं तलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वं वक्रोद्धृतोऽपि हृदमे न च भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरन्ति तरसा त्वयि तृप्ततृष्णा रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि राम कृष्णे मर्त्यमृतं तव पदं मरणोन्मिनाशम् तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारी स्नान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं त्वशरणो जगदेकगम्य तस्मात् त्वमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतार वरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमः श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। सर्वमङ्गल साधिके शरणे त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टिस्थिति विनाशानां शक्ति भूते सनातनी गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। शरणागत दीनार्त परित्राण परायणे सर्वस्यार्थे हरे देवी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। जय 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 महामाई की जय। जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय। जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suray Satchit Sukhasvarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So almost 3 weeks back, we had been discussing this idea of time and space and causation as the fundamental conditions, preconditions for understanding the phenomenal world around us in this lecture, The Absolute and the Manifestation of Vivekananda. Okay, here is one particular thing in this lecture of Vivekananda. What is emphasized is that what the Vedantic doctrine calls Maya and what in Western philosophy is called the framework of space, time and causation, they essentially refer to the same thing. It's the underlying structure of our minds when we try to understand any particular phenomenon or any object in front of us. The framework that we automatically use as fundamental for any kind of objective reality happens to be this space-time causation. So here was where we ended last time. Time depends on two events, just as space has to be related to outside objects. And the idea of causation is inseparable from time and space. This is the peculiar, here we start today. This is the peculiar thing about them, that they have no independent existence. This is where the whole thing starts. Yeah? So, space is defined in terms of objects and the relation between them, and we infer a background to separate objects at the same point of time, and this background that we infer is called space. Similarly, if there are two events that are occurring, then that which differentiates between them is what we call time. Again, then, time is a concept our mind uses to grasp the external universe, particularly when it comes to events happening. Space between or distance between events is measured in terms of time. Distance between objects is measured in terms of space. Time is what gives rise to dynamics or dynamical changing of entities, and space is what gives rise to geometry, science of space. Finally, causation is the relationship between events when when the occurrence of a particular event in an earlier period of time necessarily leads to the occurrence of a succeeding event. This is what's called causation. So, the human mind grasps a reality in terms of these three basic underlying frameworks: space to understand objects, time to understand events, and causation to understand the relationship between these things. Now, what is being said here is that none of these have any independent existence. What does that mean? If you did not have objects of perception, the notion of space does not make sense. If you did not have events occurring, the notion of time does not make sense. And if a succession of events is not bound up in a chain, then the notion of causation does not make sense. So these things, time, space, and causation, are fundamental mental concepts in that sense, which allow us to gain all possible knowledge in the world. These are the inferred foundation, the inferred framework of all knowledge that we gather. But they are not independent of the events that occur. They are not independent of the objects that we perceive. They are not independent of the succession of events that are bound up together in a particular chain. It is in that sense that time, space, and causation does not exist independent of, respectively, events, objects, and a succession of these. This particular idea, he's going to go on to say later on that it's not correct to say that time, space, and causation exist. It is also not right to say that time, space, and causation do not exist. Why is it not right to say that they exist? Well, their existence is a mental framework that is something that is foundational to grasping various things. So if we say objects exist, events occur, a sequence of events gets tied up together, then what we are really saying is something about objects, about events, about a succession of events. We are not saying that the abstraction that we call space, which is the framework in which objects exist, we are not saying that the abstraction which we call time, in which events occur, nor the succession which we call, which exists in the framework that we call causation, that exists. We are saying individual instances exist, and then our minds infer from this a more abstract reality, and that abstraction, depending on the context from which we are abstracting, those abstractions we are calling space, time, or causation. So it is this dependence of space, time, and causation on particular objects, particular events, particular succession of events. This dependence leads us to basically say that we cannot say that these things exist. They do not exist as physical realities out there. It is only in the interaction of the human capacity for knowledge with the external world in terms of events, in terms of objects, in terms of successions of events. It's precisely this interaction that leads to these emergent ideas in our heads, in our minds, in our hearts, that we call space-time and causation. It's in this sense that one cannot say that space-time and causation exist. On the other hand, this is from the outside in, so to speak. But if we see from the level of something more general to the level of something more concrete, then it is not possible to say that time does not exist. Why? Because as soon as we have perceived events occurring, simultaneously this abstraction that we call time comes into existence. So long as there is a succession of events, and so long as we perceive this succession as a succession, the notion of time does exist. Now, here's a basic question. This means that there is a subjective notion of time. You have a certain subjective notion of time, I have a certain subjective notion of time, a cat has a certain subjective notion of time, and so on. But what makes it time with a capital T, so to speak? What makes it universal, a common human experience? Well, we use things like clocks. In today's setup, we use these electronic time displayers called phones, etc., etc. However, what does it all assume? It basically assumes that there is something with which a correlation has been set up. An event occurring in a person's life, physical event, that is correlated to the hands of a clock going round. So two events once correlated, we are saying that these are things happening at the same time. It is this agreement that we have entered into as a species that basically allows us to say that there is a common time between various members of the species, between various inhabitants of the planet. So a clock ticking somewhere here, and a clock ticking somewhere in Brisbane, Australia, and a clock ticking somewhere in Connecticut, USA. These would all function in the same way. This understanding basically leads us to a universal notion of time. And from that, we start inferring things about how the universe develops, and all of this is based on this common understanding that we as a species, we as human beings have. But it's not independent. It's not, even at the greatest level of abstraction, these are not independent of events, but they define and are defined in terms of events. This is what in the Vedantic doctrine at the most abstract level is what's called Maya. That means you cannot say that it is, you cannot say that it is not. Once, if it's phrased in that language, then it becomes a little abstruse. On the other hand, if you concretely think of it in terms of time, space, and causation, which we, all of us, at least in our waking state, perhaps in our dream state, perceive or infer that we perceive, once we identify these two things, this notion of Maya with this notion of time, space, and causation, then we immediately see the point of saying that it is not possible to say that these things are. We cannot say they are as real as this room around us, as this camera in front of me, as this mic in front of me. They are not objects of perception, but they are inferred realities. Inferred in order to comprehend the external world. On the other hand, it's equally impossible to say that they do not exist, because as soon as we see some particular object, as soon as we record in our minds some particular event, we have simultaneously recorded space along with it. we have simultaneously recorded time along with it. The basic thing that we should bear in mind is that this investigation, this analysis, is supposed to be a science of the subject, of the human subject. Once we start analyzing it, then in the most fundamental aspects of our being, we find that there is this internal mechanism which records time, which records space, which records causation, because without that there would be no knowledge. Without knowledge, we would not be able to perform anything under the sun or beyond it. We would not be able to eat, sleep, go around without an awareness of what's happening. But at the basis of it all, there is this conundrum. We cannot say the framework through which we grasp reality, namely space, time, and causation. We cannot say that this framework is. We cannot say that this framework is not. In the Vivekchudamani, Shankara gives this following lovely description of what he calls Maya. Sannapya sannapi ubhayat hi ubhayatmikano. Bhinna api abhinna hi ubhayatmikano. Sat na api. We cannot say that it is. It's basically what we've been discussing. Sat na api. Asat na. We cannot say it is. We cannot say it is not. We cannot say it is both. Sannapya asatna ubhi ubhayatmikano. Yeah. So we cannot say it is there, we cannot say it is not, we cannot say it is both. Bhinna api abhinna. Is it different from objects? We cannot say that. Can we say it is not different? We cannot say so. Can we say that it is both different and not different? We cannot say so. And then finally he concludes, Mahad bhuta hi anirvachaniya maya. Nothing can be said about it. Mahad bhuta. Great strangeness, great wonder. This, a very similar thing, I think those of you who have attended or have listened to lectures by Swami Sarvapriyananda, he has often said that there is this mirroring between Advaita Vedanta on the one hand and Madhyamaka Buddhism on the other. There is a mirror set of ideas, worldview in Madhyamaka Buddhism as well. They call it Pratitya Samutpada, dependent arising. Yeah? So the moment an object arises in your consciousness, space arises simultaneously. The moment events occur in your consciousness, time arises. Whenever a chain of a succession of events occur, causation arises. These are mutually dependent. You cannot say that one is the cause, the other is the effect. You cannot say one is the basis, the other is the subsequent reality. This is what's called Pratitya Samutpada in Buddhist worldview. But it's essentially pointing towards the same ideas, that you cannot separate it out one from the other. Today, with the development of science, we do have a more fundamental understanding of what constitutes time. Should be something that's measurable, right? How can we say that time is, suppose you are shown a movie, yeah? all of you would be able to detect whether things are, suppose somebody who wanted to play a practical joke decided to play the film backward. Then, essentially, unless the film is something very exceptionally crafted to particularly delude the audience, you would be able to say that whether time is flowing, whether the movie is moving in the right direction or not. Say, for example, you take a cup and let it fall from, well, please don't perform this experiment, we'll just shatter a cup, but just let's perform it in thought. As the Germans say, Gedanken, thought experiment. So pick a cup and let it fall to the floor. And suppose you take a picture of this, take a sequence, basically a movie of this thing happening. Now run it backward. What will you see? What you will see is essentially that the shattered pieces of the cup assemble themselves together and become a whole cup. And you show that to anybody, that reverse order thing, they'll be able to say that, look, this is something that's happening with time reversed. Why is that the case? Why can we detect this? Why can we say that, look, if it's a movie that's being run in the forward direction, then a cup can fall down and get shattered. But if a cup is coming together, the shattered pieces are coming together and assembling to a usable cup, then it's actually time running in the reverse direction. Why? Essentially, we instinctively understand that if a system is not guided, what happens is that the amount of disorder in the system keeps on increasing. And this increase in disorder is what marks out time. This has a fancy name. It's called the second law of thermodynamics in physics. It's a fundamental idea. It's what determines a way for us to measure time, independent of everything else. So, there are ways of saying, but how is that time measured? It's measured in terms of events. In this particular case, a cup shattering and increasing disorder. So there are these ways today, but the scientific way of measuring it also involves this dependence of time in terms of events, and from a sequence of events, one can measure whether order in the system is increasing or decreasing. And this natural direction of increase in disorder has a technical name called entropy, is what we call the forward direction of time. But then it is defined in terms of events again. Let's get on with this. They have no independent existence. They have not even the existence which the chair or the wall has. They are as shadows around everything which you cannot catch. They have no real existence. Yet they are not non-existent, seeing that through them all things are manifesting as this universe. Thus we see first that the combination of time, space and causation has neither existence nor non-existence. Sannapya sannaphi ubayatmikano. Thus we see first that the combination of time, space and causation has neither existence nor non-existence. Secondly, it sometimes vanishes. And this is a pointer to something else. Sometimes it vanishes. Does the subjective notion of time vanish? Does the subjective notion of space vanish? Does the subjective notion of causation vanish? Is it part and is this vanishing of space-time causation part and parcel of our everyday experience? Think about it. We'll discuss this a little later. To give an illustration, there is a wave on the ocean. The wave is the same as the ocean, certainly, and yet we know it is a wave, and as such, different from the ocean. What makes this difference? The name and the form. Think it, that is, the idea in the mind and the form. Now, can we think of a waveform as something separate from the ocean? Certainly not. It is always associated with the ocean idea. If the wave subsides, the form vanishes in a moment, and yet the form was not a delusion. So long as the wave existed, the form was there, and you were bound to see that form. This is Maya. So here he is basically setting up this identity between this Western philosophical framework of space-time and causation and identifying it with this Uttarmimamsa or Vedantic idea of Maya. And this, again, as we discussed before, is tied up intimately with this Pratitya Samutpad idea of the Buddhists. Now, what is the point of all this? All this kind of seems at a certain level rather abstruse and certain kind of philosophical rigmarole, so to speak. What's the point of it all? And here, I think we should distinguish between what in the Eastern traditions, or at least in the Indian tradition, the word that is used in place of philosophy. Philosophus. So basically, sophos is what, it's a Greek word which means knowledge, and philo is the same thing as love. So love of knowledge. Yeah? That's what philosophy really translates to. The Indian word for it is darshana, which means worldview. Roughly translated, it really means worldview. So what are we supposed to do with all this? This doctrine of Maya, this doctrine of Pratitya Samutpad, this doctrine of space-time and causation, these ideas, these fundamental ideas. What they are supposed to do is shape our worldview. So, if the human mind tries to unify, this precisely is the principle of knowledge. It tries to unify the various things, the multifarious events that occur around him or her, the multifarious objects that he or she sees, and sequences of events that go along. It's not possible to take those events and put them inside one's head. It's not possible to take the external world that we perceive and put it inside our heads. What we can do is form a map. And the more comprehensive that map, the more unified our knowledge. This unification of various events, various objects, various causal chains in our minds is what gives rise to a unified view of the world around us. In short, it gives rise to knowledge of the world, including ourselves. Later on, we'll come to this next week. Our perceptions are conditioned by a certain trichotomy. There's a subject or knower or perceiver. There's an object or known or perceived. And there's a process connecting these two. Perception or knowledge or cognition. Any empirical event, any empirical piece of knowledge brings along with it this trichotomy: a subject, an object, a connection between them. Now, let's return to this question of something we had posed a little while back. Is there some part of our experience where time vanishes? Is there a part of our existence where space vanishes? Is it part and parcel of our daily experience also that causation vanishes? And this question turns out it's the same question as, say, asking whether this, what's called triputi in the Sanskrit literature, the subject, object, and the connection between them, this triad or triputi as it's called, does this triad vanish? And indeed, if we think about it a little bit, there is indeed something like this which is part and parcel of our common sense daily experience. When we are asleep, without dreams, dreamless sleep, do we have a perception of ourselves as a distinct observer? No. Is there an object of perception? No. And therefore there is no connection. So the triad of subject, object, and experience has vanished in deep sleep. Does time exist there? Is there a subjective perception of time in deep sleep? No. Is there a subjective perception of space in deep sleep? No. And since there are no events, there is no succession of events, there is no causality. There is no event succeeding another, and there is no chain, there is no causal chain. So space, time, and causation does vanish in deep sleep. And one does not have to go to any mystical lengths to understand it. It's part and parcel of every human being's experience. So the answer to is there a point in our day-to-day experience where space vanishes, time vanishes, causation vanishes? Answer, yes, in deep sleep. And the same about this triad, this triputi of subject, object, and the connection between them. In the state of deep sleep, all of this vanishes. It's only when we come out of it, you say, okay, I was sleeping soundly, I did not know anything. In Sanskrit it says, Sukham aham aswapsam na kinchit avedisham. I did not know anything. Why? Because when we wake up and we say, I did not know anything, it means that we did not know anything in terms of which we understand anything in the waking state, or let's say even the dream state. So the waking state knowledge, I knew something, I know something, presupposes this triad, the subject, object, and the experience. or it assumes this space, time and causation. But if the framework itself has vanished, as it does as part and parcel of our daily experience, at least for those who have some sound sleep, rarity nowadays. But once that's there, once you grant that part as something that's common human experience, then this vanishing of the framework is also something that we do accept. Now, if it be part and parcel of our daily experience, the question then becomes, how come that is not integrated into my experience in the here and now? How come I have trifurcated my daily experience into a waking state, a dream state, and a deep sleep state? States of existence which are mutually exclusive. And the answer, particularly the Mandukya Upanishad gives a brilliant answer to this. This trifurcation of states of existence, common sense states of existence, nothing mystical about them, into waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, is again something that we as a species have imposed at a certain sense upon ourselves. And we do have the freedom to unify. So, there's this conversation between Raman Maharshi and somebody who had come there, when he was saying, what about deep sleep? And he says, in deep sleep you seem to be pretty happy, and then there's nothing to be nothing that one wants. The person says, well, how do I think of deep sleep? And he says, to me, deep sleep seems to be just a blank. And his response is very interesting. Enquire to whom it is the blank. This repeated emphasis there is on enquiring into to whom something happens. Which is why that book from which all these things are taken, from which everything emanated, a little booklet called Naniyar in Tamil, Who Am I? It's an enquiry into the subject, the science of the subject. Essentially, when we ask about something outside, some events occurring outside, and we ask for a scientific investigation, what we are really after is a unifying piece of knowledge. Here, what one is asking is, what is universal about subjective experience? It's a science of subjective experience at its most universal. That is what one is after. And I'll conclude here. Even these fundamental ideas of such and such is, or such and such is not. Something is there, something is not there. This fundamental polarity, we've discussed this several times before, is also a fundamental way of functioning of the mind. In deep sleep, one does not say one is. In deep sleep, one does not say one is not. You cannot say. Why? Because as soon as an instrument comes into existence to say that it is, simultaneously the idea of is not is what it contrasts with. Which is why, in the Kathamrita, in some place, referring to this reality, Sri Ramakrishna says that Osti Nasti Pare, beyond existence and non-existence. Does it mean beyond existence and non-existence in some mystical sense? No. It basically says it is our minds that say that something is, it is our minds that say that something is not. Without this kind of dichotomy, the mind would not be able to grasp this common sense reality that we see around us. But here the inquiry is into the foundations of the mind from which these ideas of isness or existence and not isness, which means non-existence, arises. That is to be probed. And fortunately, the greatest experimental raw data is something that is part and parcel of every human existence. And that is the state of deep sleep where our common sense way of grasping things vanish. The idea then is to make that experience of deep sleep as conscious as possible. Something that can be brought into our consciousness on a day-to-day basis. At that level, that which one is after, as the Upanishads never tire of telling us, is ihaiva, here itself, in the here and the now. Not something post-mortem, not something that happens after death or some mystical twilight, but in the here and now. And recently, I think I've mentioned this here, there's a beautiful little book, well, not very little, it's quite expansive, called Quantum Computing Since Democritus. This is a computer scientist, and he writes that consciousness has this strange dual aspect. We cannot know it. We do not know it. But it is in and through this consciousness that we know everything. So though it is something that and it is in some sense the only thing that we can be aware of in a direct way without the mediation of anything else. So what would be the quest for such a thing? How would one proceed to inquire into it? It is precisely by making the mind calm and introspective with a sharp way of cutting through these conventions of the mind through which we are trying to understand external reality. It is focusing the mind on its own origins. For that, calmness of the mind is a sine qua non, which is why all these disciplines, etc., are prescribed. But there's a rationale behind it. If one is interested in this kind of a foundation of one's own mind, so to speak, same question, Nanyar, same question, who am I? Yeah? Same question is for people who are theistically inclined, a quest for God, etc., etc., or the spiritual quest. Give it whatever name you like. For all of these, this focusing of the mind is essential, and hence this calming of the mind as a practical method for getting at this. So the Kathopanishad puts it very beautifully. Na virato duscharitan na shanto na samahita na shanta manasa yasya pragyanena na eva apnuyat. So basically the idea is, if the mind keeps on bursting into waves, into various cravings, it's not possible for it to get unified and penetrating and subtle. And without that, there is no way to get at the core of what this is trying to tell us. We'll resume again here next week. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.